when their kingdoms or empires collapsed. And collapse is actually something that is very, very interesting in historiography, because nothing tells you more about a certain country than collapse, how it actually came down, how it was unraveled. For example, a lot of people, when they're talking about the Roman Empire, talk about the glory days of Caesar Augustus, rather than how it fell during the 5th century. Although there was a historian called Edward Gibbon who basically wrote a long-ass book about it. That's like 1,200 pages, I think. So, and I've never really finished that book. Sorry, it's too long. Anyway, it's interesting how the Roman Empire, or most empires, collapsed, because most empires collapse as a result of a natural process. And if you are an economics major, by a process that is very familiar to you. How about the law of diminishing returns? You know, what's law of diminishing returns if you've taken economics? It's a pretty well-known rule. Diminishing returns. Yes. Basically, less and less returns for the same investment. And the same law is at work for almost all kingdoms and empires. When they are first conquering, you're conquering tribes and taking away their land and taking away their assets. You bring assets in. Now, you're gaining more and more and more wealth. That, you can say, is energy that can feed the growth of that kingdom or an empire. And when you have so many resources that you can extend that energy to a very wide territory, now you have an empire. However, when that expansion stops, now you have all this land. Do you just give it up because you can't administer it? No. You have to send soldiers out, you have to send bureaucrats out. Now these soldiers and bureaucrats had to be paid. Now all this land is a drain on your resources. It has to be paid for by the taxes out of your own treasury. Because your empire or kingdom is now at peace, more farmland is cultivated, your population rises. Now there are more mouths to feed. They have to be taken care of. They have to be taxed. More bureaucrats, more soldiers, more resources expended into just maintaining your kingdom. Now, unless you expand even more and bring more resources in, now you start a slow, very slow process of collapse. Because you're not expanding anymore. You're not bringing assets in. And that's eventually how Goguryeo collapsed, by the same process. Now, people talk about collapse in history as if it's a bad thing. Well, it's to the rulers, it's a bad thing, yes. But collapse, it's not a breakdown, let's say. It's not a breakdown as most people understand it. Collapse is simply a process where a political entity of a given complexity cannot maintain that complexity. It's simply too complex it has become too complex and too big to maintain. So it is broken down and reorganized actually at a stage of lesser complexity. Empires break down into kingdoms. Kingdoms sometimes break down into these lordships and duchies and tribal realms. That's what collapse is. And it's the same process that followed Goguryeo. And however, as you can see here, Goguryeo did not fully collapse. Goguryeo was an empire. It had many, many far-flung provinces. It had governors. It had, many, many generals, bureaucrats. And son of one of those surviving generals, named Daejeong. And Daejeong is also a very interesting character because Daejeong, by all accounts, was not necessarily ethnically Korean, if you will, they say. He was actually a member of a frontier tribe named Malgao. However, if you're talking about citizenship, he probably fully believed himself to be a Goguryeo citizen. Why? Because his ancestors for many generations had served the Goguryeo emperors and he probably thought of himself as a fully Goguryeo general. So his ethnic background does not matter. And that's how empires work, bringing tribes and other ethnicities in and giving them a new identity as imperial citizens. And that's what happened with Daejeong. And when Goguryeo collapsed, his father and he took upon themselves to rebuild Goguryeo. That was their initial goal. Going back to what I said yesterday, when empires go to war with each other and one empire wins and the other empire loses, the winning empire makes sure that the other empire does not come back to life. They make sure that the losing empire is completely destroyed. Like, for example, burning down the capital, for example, ruining farmlands. And in the case of the Tang, what they did was the Goguryeo capital of Pyongyang had a population of somewhere around 250,000 people. They took them all away. And you're talking about the top intellectuals, the top bureaucrats, top engineers, aristocrats. Every learned, anyone that could become an asset to an eventual Goguryeo restoration was actually taken out of the capital and forcibly repatriated in China, never to come back. So the Chinese were trying to make sure that Goguryeo did not come back to life again. However, since Goguryeo was an empire, it had other sort of secondary centers around here and around here. And those areas actually survived. The only areas of Goguryeo that was damaged, that was destroyed by the invasion was around here. And those people were taken to Tang, and actually they were not taken to the inland of China, but they were held in a sort of like a refugee city named Yingzhou. Yingzhou literally means a camp city. It actually translates into camp city. And that's where all the refugees and all the captives and POWs from here, around here, in the nomadic areas were gathered. And of course, being captives, they were ill-treated. They were not treated very well. And after about 30 years, a lot of these people eventually had had enough. They rose up in a huge rebellion in 698, killed the camp master, and the Khitan, which was a nomadic tribe, the POWs gathered themselves into an army and launched an invasion of China. However, the Goguryeo refugees, their goal was not the invasion of China. Their goal was not the destruction of China, but restoring their kingdom. And Daejeong led them back this way. Eventually, those Khitan tribes that were here, they were defeated. And when they were defeated, the Tang Chinese army started chasing them. And the refugee army made a stand here at a place called Cheonmunyeong, or roughly translates into the Heaven's Gate. And there's actually a mural or a drawing in the war memorial that depicts the battle. And the refugee forces actually managed to defeat the pursuing Tang Chinese army and set up their capital here. This is what their first capital looked like, and it is located in present-day Jilin, which is in the northeast of China. Now, like all founding kingdoms do, they built their capital up on a hill, because with all founding empires, all founding kingdoms, defense is paramount. Since you're still weak, keeping yourself safe is the primary goal. However, the good thing is, after this initial battle in 698, the Tang was in no position to intervene again, because they had bigger matters out in the west. There was the Turks. The Turks basically got themselves back into a nomadic empire again, so they were a threat again. There was the kingdom of Sogdia, which actually created those Afrasia frescoes that showed up in your midterms. And also there was the Tibetan kingdom, by now, which was an empire and constituted the main threat to the Tang dynasty. So the Tang was engaged with them in the west, and had they basically had no intention of intervening in the east because they had bigger enemies out in the west. And by the time they either negotiated a peace or managed to defeat their rivals, the Balhae, the new kingdom, which was now Balhae, was firmly established. Now, the Tang Chinese, they want to sort of bring the Balhae kingdom back into its orbit. So what they did was, like all empires do, they demanded tribute. They said, "You become my vassal." And of course, when the third king of Balhae said, "I'll think about it," the Tang engaged in sort of like a surrounding tactic, divide and conquer tactic, by going around and trying to convince these people called the Malgal to turn against Balhae. And that actually created a huge division within the Balhae royalty. Basically, the king's younger brother became very afraid, saying that the Tang is maneuvering against us. Look how they defeated Goguryeo, and we're going to suffer the same fate. The older brother, the king, saying, "No, we are strong. None of that's going to happen." Of course, they couldn't agree, and of course, the younger brother kept maintaining his argument to the point where his brother, the king, got very angry and said, "If you keep this up, I will have your head." And of course, afraid for his life, the brother fled here to the Malgal tribes. But of course, the older brother, he sent a huge army after him, which forced the younger brother to flee across the steppes into the Tang. And of course, when the king found out, he demanded his younger brother, "You have my political prisoner. You have my political criminal there. My younger brother is a traitor. You hand them over to me." And of course, the Tang Chinese, it sort of, this whole episode looks like a very exciting espionage sequence, because when the Balhae emissaries arrived at the Tang capital, they said, well, your younger brother is not here. We sent him off because he is a criminal. We've decided to punish him for you by sending him off to some distant southern province. Of course, the Balhae emissaries thought, I think they're lying. And they eventually found out. And of course, the Balhae king, the older brother, he actually sent 2 assassins after his younger brother. Twice, actually. And how did this get recorded into the history books? Well, those assassins, I think, were not very good people. They were not very good at their jobs because they failed twice, and they were caught and killed. And of course, that made the Tang emperor very angry, but the Balhae king, of course, decided to take matters into his own hand. We're not going to wait for the Tang to invade. We're going to launch a preemptive strike right here. And he sent Marines, loaded tens of thousands of Marines in a bunch of ships, and attacked here. And they actually occupied the city for a few weeks. However, Balhae had no intentions of actually keeping the city, because it was simply meant as a show of force to basically show their displeasure, while the king led land forces up to here. And of course, the Tang, rather than go on a full-scale war, decided that, okay, maybe we should actually punish this traitor, and they actually did eventually ship him off to a southern province. Of course, that was not before the Tang actually convinced Silla, which many nationalist Korean historians actually consider a Chinese lackey, by the way, decided to attack Balhae from the south. And that's actually one of the reasons why Balhae retreated across the sea in due haste. So the whole thing actually reads like an event, like a born identity kind of thing. However, in the end, this is what happened to Balhae. What am I talking about? Well, Goguryeo was an empire. There is a very important difference between Goguryeo and Balhae, which supposedly succeeded Goguryeo. Goguryeo for its part, had its own system of bureaucracy. It had its own system of, provincial, regional government. It had its own system of, taxation and whatnot. So it had whatever, it basically ruled its country under its own system. However, as for Balhae, it modeled pretty much its entire government system upon the Chinese system, because for some reason they either found it convenient or they thought the Chinese system was better. So the Balhae Empire, well, I do have to say kingdom, because in a way, Balhae never really asserted itself as an empire as Goguryeo did. And one of the hallmarks of Chinese regional government is they actually divide up the land and have sort of secondary capitals near those regional provinces. And that's what Balhae did. It created a main capital, which is right here, and several other secondary capitals spread all over the country. It's usually called, in the Chinese system, the 5-capital system, where there's the main capital at the center, and supposedly there's a secondary capital in the north, the south, the east, and the west. So in all 5 capitals, in all 5 cardinal directions, including the center. First part, the Balhae capital was a very prosperous city. It was actually, however, it actually was modeled after the Chinese Tang capital of Chang'an, which was the biggest city. After the destruction of Pyongyang, Chang'an became the biggest city in East Asia, and that's what the Balhae capital was modeled after. The square layout, the square blocks. This is exactly how the Chinese capital of Chang'an was laid out, and so was the Balhae capital. And these are remnants of the walls of the former Balhae capital. And here's the platform upon which one of the palaces stood. I actually went there in 1993 when all this was actually not present. In fact, this was covered over by long grass. It wasn't really like spruced up. It wasn't really organized. No, it wasn't very clean. But I guess in a way it was organized enough so that the guard actually came out and demanded 3 renminbi yuan from me. Meaning the guard actually had enough sense to actually notice me, sort of walking around and demand, an entrance fee. Because he obviously did not expect any visitors to come to this palace out in the middle of nowhere. And in fact, it was out in the middle of nowhere back in 1993. However, they obviously sort of, brightened it up after that. And by the late 9th century, Balhae, in fact, at least territorially, had grown bigger than the Goguryeo it succeeded. And its territories stretched from the Korean Peninsula, from the Liaodong Peninsula, all the way into the Primorsky Krai in maritime Russia. Now, as this was happening up north, what was happening in Shilla? And in Shilla, at least bureaucratically, regional government, much the same. It modeled its system of regional government after the standard Chinese system. First of all, it had the main capital here and 5 secondary capitals. The system of 5 capitals, again, you can see right here. And of Shilla, after the so-called unification, they divided their entire kingdom into 9 provinces. Now, 9 actually has a political significance and historical significance in East Asia, because supposedly it was how the earliest unifier of China, namely some figure named King Yu, divided up the entirety of China. He divided it up into 9 provinces. So that supposedly became the model for all empires and kingdoms that came after. And Shilla obviously accorded themselves to that Chinese model and divided their country into 9 provinces. So that's what makes the fall of Goguryeo very significant in East Asia because, like I said, Goguryeo did everything according to its own system. It actually it actually became a political and a cultural rival of China, but after its defeat, there were no actual rivals, meaning everyone now modeled themselves after China. China, for all intents and purposes, became the center, both politically and culturally. However, for all its power, Tang China was somehow unable to control the seas. It was probably so busy controlling its empire, it did not do anything about what was happening out in the sea, especially in the Yellow Sea right here. And what was happening was Tang China was racked by, well, it was first of all fighting enemies to the west, but also it was racked by very frequent rebellions because Tang China was one of the more militarized Chinese empires in history, and that meant giving a lot of military power to the regional governors. And those regional governments were in the habit of consolidating their power and throwing up and rebelling against the emperor. And so it was frequently fighting wars of rebellion, and of course they could not actually mind their territorial seas, which was the Yellow Sea. So pirates proliferated around here, which meant people along the Shilan coast suffered the consequences. The pirates would descend upon the Korean coast, take the fishermen and the villagers living along the coast, and sold them as slaves to China. Because why did slavery proliferate? Well, it wasn't just here. It proliferated on coastal regions all over the world. And why was slavery such a prolific industry in the pre-modern era? Because it wasn't gold or iron or anything that was the most expensive commodity in pre-modern era. It was labor. People constitute the greatest asset. So even if you can, sell a person's weight in gold against an actual person, you would actually buy a person and work them for decades. And you actually got more wealth out of that person rather than gold, which is just sitting there in your safe. So that's why slavery proliferated, and that was actually the case in East Asia also. And of course, Shilla, although it unified the Korean. In Shilla, that was they actually called it the bone system. And depending on which bone you are, and under the bones there were the heads, or which heads you are, it literally limited your opportunities. For example, say if you are a fifth head, for example, there were actually written limitations on how far a fifth head could go up the bureaucratic ladder. For example, the Shilin bureaucracy operated on a 12-grade system. And I believe if you are the fifth head, you could not go up past 6th grade, I believe. So opportunities were limited. So if you were a commoner, if you were not even a head, but a commoner, forget it. You're not getting anywhere. You just farmed or fished until the day you died. So this particular commoner named Zhang Baogo thought, my life isn't going to go anywhere in Shilla. So he thought, but I can shoot a bow. I'm a crack archer. I'll take my archery skills and go over to Tang China. And he actually distinguished himself in the wars of rebellion there. and rose to the rank of what is sort of commensurate with the rank of brigadier general in the modern army. Now he was a general in the Tang Chinese army. Now he had some position and status. He came back to Shilla, and also he had experience running and operating fleets. So he actually had the audacity to show up in Gyeongju and make a proposition to the prime minister and the king, saying that since no one seems to be putting an effort to end piracy, I will do it for you. However, I do have a demand. You will give me this island of Wando as my personal fief. Meaning, I know you're the king here, I know you're the prime minister here, but as far as Wando is concerned, that's mine. That was the deal, and they said, well, you're going to do all the work for us? Fine, you have Wando. And what he did was, he had amassed, a lot of wealth and money in Tang China, so he brought all that wealth back to Wando, built a naval base there, built a fleet, and swept the entire Yellow Sea of pirates. And soon, that meant all the ships that were sailing in the Yellow Sea right here, those were his ships. And his fleet numbered well past 200 ships. So he virtually had a monopoly on the trade between China, Shilla, and Japan, meaning that made him a very, very wealthy man. And he even shows up in modern 19th century Western scholarship. And a certain Western historian named Gary Reich, Edwin Reischauer, even goes far as to say he was a virtual merchant prince who basically ruled all the seas around Korea. And of course, he, at the peak of his power, he commanded over 10,000 troops. Well, of course, there are people who might say, 10,000, big deal, right? Well, if you actually sort of calculate the cost of maintaining and feeding 10,000 troops, you would know the scale of his wealth. Okay, take out your smartphones for a minute and let's do some calculations. Let's calculate the rice or the amount of food that will be required to feed 10,000 people. Okay, I am told that a bowl of rice, which is about 200 grams of rice, is about 300 calories. So an adult male requires about, 2,000 calories a day? Now, translate into rice, that's like 6 bowls of rice, right? And of course, since you're eating 3, however, since they would be eating other food, let's limit that to 3 bowls of rice a day. That's 600 grams of rice per person a day, right? And multiply that by 10,000, and you would have the amount of rice needed to feed those 10,000 men for a single day. 10,000 men for a single day. So 600 grams times 10,000, which is in kilograms or tons. How many tons? Yeah, 6 tons of rice every day. Yeah. Why is rice so popular in Korea? Well, because rice, compared to all other grains, gives you the greatest yield per land, for the same amount of land that's used to till the grain. Rice gives you the greatest yield, the biggest harvest out of all the grains. Compared to like meat or wheat or whatever, rice gives you the biggest harvest. That's why. So it was simply a matter of being practical. And so you need 6 tons of rice every day, meaning you need stretch that for a year, you need 1,000 tons of rice for a year. I mean, in a pre-modern society, 1,000 tons of rice is a very significant amount. So that's how much wealth he needed to simply feed those 10,000 men. And then, of course, he needed, marine engineers. He also needed to feed those sailors. He needed to maintain, the barracks over there. So it means he needed a lot of wealth. And he did that by, monopolizing trade right here. So much so that, his merchants and shillans actually sailed on their ships and set up these shilla towns all over the Chinese coast. They actually, settled into enclaves where probably you could go through a town for a day without speaking Chinese. And by the same measure, I was told that in a certain section of Los Angeles, you can actually walk on the streets of Olympic Boulevard and not speak English, and you would be fine. So you had that kind of situation all over the eastern coast of China. Then, of course, I think I sort of told you what happened to this guy in the War Memorial, in that there was a frequent battle for the throne in Shilla, meaning kings were being killed by their rivals and being replaced as kings. And of course, one of those defeated princes actually came here asking for help. And of course, the defeated prince said, okay, I know you have ships, I know you have money, I know you have troops. Please help me, and I will be eternally grateful. And of course, Zhang Bogo, being a very practical man, says, no. Being grateful isn't enough. If you become king, you have to do something for me. And that is marry my daughter. You make my daughter a queen, I'll give you my 10,000 troops. And he did, and managed to kill the king that was a pretender that was sitting on the throne, and this prince became king. However, after that, the king was, of course, was met with very fierce opposition from the aristocrats, saying, you cannot marry this commoner daughter. So what the king did was sent a friend of Zhang Bogo's on an supposed as an emissary to negotiate a political deal. Of course, in reality, he was simply an assassin in disguise, and this friend managed to get Zhang Bogo drunk, cut off his head, and buried him in a nameless grave, unmarked grave. So after that, this whole trading fleet, this entire maritime operation simply collapsed, and there was pirates all over the coast again, and Shillan economy suffered as well. Shilla was actually profiting very handsomely from this trade, to the point where this was the layout, this was what the capital looked like in the 8th century, in the late 8th century and the early 9th century, when trade was bustling around the coast of Shilla. The Shillan capital of Gumsong, which is now Gyeongju, had a population of 800,000, which is, very, very big for a pre-modern city. Okay, for perspective, right around this time, the Chinese capital of Chang'an had 800,000. Baghdad had 600,000. Constantinople had 500,000. So you can sort of see how populous Gyeongju actually was. The city was so huge, it had to be divided into 55 separate districts, and it had 1,360 city blocks. And this sort of tells you how much wealth that Shilla and the city had. There was no house in Gyeongju Gumsong that had a grass roof. Well, as building materials go, grass roof is readily available, so that's why people built roofs out of grasses, because you can just cut it off the field and lay it on top of your house. And if it's maintained well, if you keep moisture out of that, I was told that grass roofs actually have pretty good insulating properties. However, since people had money, they didn't want these rotting grasses on top of their houses. No, they wanted tiles. Why tiles? Because tiles were expensive items, expensive building items. Tiles were not just made out of simply just made with earth and dried. Tiles first had to be made, then dried, then cooked in an oven, then lathered with lacquer before it was made ready for use. Meaning it took time to make each and every one of these tiles, and meaning they were expensive items, and people had enough money to actually, cover their whole houses with these tiles. Meaning the capital was a very, very wealthy place at this point. And there were even people who wanted to flaunt this wealth. They said, we're not going to have regular old tiles in my house. I want my tiles covered in gold. And so there were 36 huge mansions whose roofs were basically golden. And remember the article that I posted on the group page about the Persian prince, about the capital overflowing with gold and people like walking their dogs on a golden leash? Well, it's not very far from the truth, because the city had these 36 huge mansions that was covered in gold, that glittered in gold every sunset. So what that Persian prince saw was probably these houses right here. Dozens of bridges over rivers, sewer system, which were again very expensive to maintain, meaning Gyeongju and Shilla was a place overflowing of wealth come the 8th and the 9th century. Some of that wealth was parlayed into cultural monuments, like the Sakuram Grotto that you see here. By the way, has anyone went to Gyeongju, by the way? Well, if you go to Gyeongju, this basically is a must-see. Although it's a little ways removed from the city itself, you do have to take a bus, but it is sort of worth seeing it. However, I do have to say that the word grotto here is a misnomer. Grotto, what's a grotto? Grotto is essentially a structure built into a natural cave. Although this looks like a cave, it's actually not. It's actually located at the foot of a mountain, but it's not actually a grotto. In fact, it is a wholly artificial stone temple, built from the ground up with granite. And this is the layout of the Sakuram's grotto, which is in fact not a grotto at all, but a stone temple. And this is how it was built. This is the engineering schematic on how it was built. And also, it was also pretty difficult to build in terms of masonry and stone cutting. Has anyone done like stone cutting before? But I was told that the stones that went into building this temple is actually one of the most difficult stones to work with, which is dense granite. Granite is very, very hard to work with a chisel and hammer. Now compare that to other grottos around East Asia, which are in fact grottos, which are Buddhist statues and figures carved into mountain caves. Here's the one in Yungang in Shanxi in China, and here's one in Maharashtra in India, and they are actually grottos. However, in terms of stoneworking, not to denigrate the efforts of people who built this, because I'm sure a lot of effort went into these as well. However, I was told that these caverns are actually formed of sandstone, which are very soft compared to the granite that was used to build Sakuram Grotto. However, even for all that money in Shilla, they actually did not have money to build this bell. Now, I told you that Buddhism had now become the royal and the national religion of Shilla. And of course, the best way to sort of flaunt royal authority was to build huge Buddhist monuments. In terms of, you can build a huge temple, or you can make a huge bell like this and donate it to a temple. And when they were building this bell, legend has it that they failed each time. Why? Because, a bell like this could not be molded or could not be cast in part. They had to be cast whole. Because putting them, making parts and putting them, assembling them together would make the entire thing weak, especially at the creases. So it has to be made whole. The problem was when you pour that much metal at once into a mold, the problem is because of the heat, the mold expands very rapidly. And the mold simply exploded because it could not handle that expansion. So they fail. Every time that they try to cast this out of bronze, they would fail and fail and fail. And they did not know what to do with it. But the legend has it that so they need to go on collection or donation drives every time they were making this bell. And during one of those drives, there was one woman who was so poor that she could not donate anything except, I have nothing else to give you except for my baby daughter. And the baby daughter was given as a donation. And the baby daughter was, the legend has it, thrown into the pool of boiling metal. And finally, the bell was made. And some people actually tried to give, scientific, give scientific logic to this process by saying, well, in order to bond all this bronze together, you need phosphorus is an essential element. And they probably needed the phosphorus from the child's bones. However, that argument is, for the lack of a better word, a crock of BS. Why? How much phosphorus do you think is in the bones of that little girl? Very little. How much metal do you think it went into casting this bell? You're talking about 28 tons of bronze. So that little phosphorus in those little girls' bones, that's not going to do anything. So it's a crock of BS. They probably just dumped in a bunch of animal bones in it. However, why did they come up with the legend? Well, it just makes it more dramatic and so sort of highlights the efforts of the people who made it and the king who basically sponsored it. Balhae, for its part, was also pretty big on Buddhism, and its remaining monuments, one of its standout monument is, of course, a Buddhist stone lamp, which sits in a place called Dongjingcheng, which is actually one of the secondary capitals of Balhae. And about 30 years ago, I think, they discovered a tomb of a Balhae princess, which is in the city of Dunhua in southern Manchuria. And of course, many colorful characters, graced this time period, and none other than that commissioner who took the island of Wando as his personal territory. And a Saguk drama was actually made on that commissioner named Zhang Bogo, entitled The Emperor of the Sea in 2004. And by the way, see this actor right here? If you look at all the other dramas, historical dramas from 2000 to about 2005, he's probably in a dozen of them because he was simply the standout face of these historical dramas. Right now, I believe it's up until 2010, it was an actor named Song Il-guk, but I think his career has passed too. But anyway, as dramas go, this was pretty good because they actually had something to base it off of, which was actually a 10-volume historical novel. So they had something to work off of. So to make a long story short, the story didn't go to hell because, yes, it had a solid base on which to base it on. So Taiji, the person who created this whole Hallyu boom, he actually shot a music video with the title Balhae in the title. And this was actually a song about unification, and they actually shot the video in a very well-known structure from the Korean War. It is actually probably one of the last remaining North Korean buildings in South Korea. It's at a place called Chalwon, and this building happens to be the remnant of the local Workers' Party building. And essentially, the song is about unification, and they use balhae as a symbolism of a time when Korea indeed had a large territory and was a strong country, and not a divided, weak country as they perceived themselves to be. And here's sort of like a martial arts epic based on people who are trying to restore balhae after it fell to the Khitan in 926. But if you're looking for a Korean martial arts epic, don't go looking for this. It's a pretty bad one. However, going back to actual history, Shilla was now, by this time, going to hell. Because unification had been its driving goal all along, before it was unified. After unification was achieved, it suddenly lost its greatest national objective. Now, people were either farming or enjoying their wealth or whatever, but there was no grand objective anymore. Meaning the kings had, even the kings themselves or the queens, had nothing to work for, except battle each other for the throne. And this is very, very telling if you take the average reign years of each king. Before 780, when there was a major upheaval of all the aristocrats who were trying to take over the throne, before 780, an average, when the king came to the throne, he or she ruled for about 23 years. After this, a king ruled for an average of less than 8 years. Meaning, now, after 780, being king was very dangerous business. In fact, there was one king who was on the throne for less than 1 year, in fact, 4 months. He was, in fact, the king that was killed by Jeongbo-go. And of course, with all the power, with all the battle for the throne going on in the center, well, a lot of these local governors and aristocrats, they basically noticed that orders were not forthcoming from the Gyeongju government. So they said, hey, I have all the power here. I have my troops. I'll just run the show here. So they decided to literally create fiefs and little kingdoms with the territory they had. And these strong men, called hojok in Korean, sprang up all over the country. And essentially, you had a warring state situation in Korea come the late 9th century, I believe. And this was all because of the head and the bone system that I talked about. Shilla had a very, very rigid system of hierarchy. And this was essentially how the aristocracy was divided up. At the top were the bones, the royalty. And under them were the heads, supposedly the aristocrats. Now, the bones, and at the top were the holy bones, but they sort of disappeared after the 7th century. Why? Well, the holy bones were the only class of people who had the right to become kings or queens. Except one major criteria for becoming king or queen was both your parents had to be a royal. Well, what does that usually lead to? I mean, the gene pool of royalty obviously is very narrow. So what does that lead to if they insist that both your parents had to be royal? There's a lot of incest. So you have a lot of incest. You had nieces marrying nephews, nieces marrying uncles, nephews marrying aunts. Sometimes cousins marrying cousins and whatnot. But even doing that, they soon ran out of male heirs. And that's when the two queens came to power in Shilla, right before unification. Now, some historians actually took that and said, look, Shilla is so egalitarian. They actually had 3 queens. No, it was not egalitarian. It was a very patriarchal, hierarchical society. Why did they have queens, however? Because those 2 women were the only holy bones remaining. They would rather have a female holy bone on the throne rather than someone else on the throne. That's why they had queens.
not because Shilin society was egalitarian. However, after the holy bones ran out, only true bones could come to the throne, and of course the heads, even if they had talents, they could not assume the throne. So a lot of these 6th and 5th heads, what they did was they went to China and they became officials there. Some people actually tried to come back and reform Shilin society, make it into a little more flexible, open society. However, there was a lot of aristocratic resistance. One of the things that they tried to do, especially a figure named Che Chi-wan, who actually became a high-ranking official in Tang China, what he tried to do was come back and institute the civil service exams in Shilla. In Shilla, your position was based on birth. At least with the civil service exam, nominally it was based on talent. And even that, the aristocrats put up a very fierce resistance against it. And of course, when he tried to institute that system, it was simply abandoned, abolished after just 30 years. So after that, there was no system of social advancement based on talent. Meaning the 6th head like him, now they had nowhere to go. So what did they do? Well, they were still learned people. They were upper middle class. They were intellectuals. They had all this talent. But they could not become high-ranking officials. They could not become kings. So what do? They go off and serve those generals and warlords. They become the advisors and generals for those warlords. Meaning now the warlords have all this infusion of talent. Meaning they become powerful, whereas the central government becomes weaker because no talent is going that way. So this rigid social system actually contributes to dissolution of Shilla. Shilla literally starts breaking apart into these little bitty bits. And those warlords battle each other until 2 of those warlords consolidate their kingdoms into later Goguryeo and later Baekje. Ironically, the founder of later Goguryeo happened to be an illegitimate Shilin prince, which there's a fascinating birth story related to his birth because when he was born, the royal astrologer said, this child will bring ill fortune upon this kingdom. He must be killed immediately. So the concubine, his mother, found out and ran off with the child, except she came to a cliff where she had nowhere to go, except the baby's nanny was waiting under the cliff, threw him under the cliff, and the nanny took her and ran off to safety. But as she was taking the child, supposedly she sort of poked the baby in the eye, lost an eye. And later, when the child grew up, now he finds out that his nanny was in fact his nanny and not his mother. And he bore a lifelong grudge and hatred towards the Shilin kingdom. In fact, he held so much hatred for the kingdom when he became a general for one of those warlords, he actually came to a temple that held the portrait of his father. He immediately took off his sword and slashed the father's portrait in half. That's how much he hated Shilla. However, in the end, he was actually done in by his trusted lieutenant because he became very suspicious, dictatorial, and despotic to the point where he was killing off his sons and wives. And in the end, this later Goguryeo was taken over by this king Gungye's lieutenant named Wang Gun, and he became the founder of Goryeo, which of course would later be called Korea by the foreigners who actually came to trade in Goryeo. So that's it for the later 3 kingdoms period. Thank you for coming, and thank you for your cooperation.